Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining us today to hear from Alex McInturff. I want to start by recognizing that the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. And I'm really pleased to say that we are joined today by Alex McInturff. Alex is a candidate for the position of Assistant Unit Leader, Wildlife in the Washington Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit, and a faculty position in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences here at University of Washington. I'm Sarah Converse, and I am the leader of the Washington Cooperative Fish and Wildlife Research Unit. USGS scientist and a faculty member in the School of Environmental and Forest Sciences. So I'd like to start by introducing Alex, and then I'll just remind folks as we go that if you have questions during Alex's presentation today, we're going to have time at the end to take those questions. So if you look down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see a little Q&A icon. Just click on that and you'll be able to enter your questions there, and then I'll help to manage those at the end. So Alex is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He studies the human dimensions of wildlife science, conducting research that works to protect wildlife and improve human livelihoods on shared landscapes. Dr. McInturff's research links the social sciences and ecology in studying how human values and perceptions drive conflicts and shape broad ecological patterns. Through agency partnerships and public engagement, this research develops just and sustainable management practices for wildlife and diverse stakeholders. As I mentioned, Dr. McInturff is a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Currently, he completed a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management at the University of California, Berkeley, and BS and MS degrees in earth systems at Stanford University. Okay, Alex, I think we are ready to take it away. So you're sharing your screen, so please go ahead and get started.
Terrific. Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me here. It's such a thrill and an honor to be here and to be able to share this with you. And so thank you, and thanks to everyone in attendance today. I've titled my talk Habitat and Habitus to underscore a core theme that I'll talk about today. And that is that habitus, which describes a collection of human perceptions, behaviors, and beliefs, is a crucial part of habitat. And linking these two ideas is vital to the future of wildlife management and to just outcomes for people and wildlife. My research is set against the backdrop of a rapidly expanding human footprint, and few species have been as impacted by these global changes as large mammals with whom we increasingly share space. And in the environmental sciences, we hear a lot of stories in this context about degradation, but I think we're in an incredibly powerful moment right now. There's great energy and opportunity around restoration. Pushes to set aside huge portions of the planet for nature are gaining momentum. Ecological restoration programs are growing in popularity around the world. And in human-dominated landscapes, there are innovative efforts to help us coexist with wildlife species on a changing planet. So the moment is ripe for restoration and for brand new ways of living with wildlife. But this moment is also balanced on a knife's edge. While our ecological understanding of wildlife management is rapidly growing, our understanding of the human dimensions of wildlife management remains poor. And it is decisions and actions of humans that often determine whether restoration will succeed or fail, and how people's lives and livelihoods will be impacted by these successes and failures. So while understanding of ecological dynamics is crucial to wildlife management, a key theme of my research is that understanding the human dimensions of wildlife is just as critical to sustainable management in the face of global changes. Now, what I've pictured here describes a traditional approach to the human dimensions of wildlife research, and this approach is powerful. But today I want to offer a newer and bolder vision, I'll repeat this throughout the talk, but human beliefs, values, and attitudes are an invisible landscape unto themselves, and they can fundamentally change ecological dynamics. So I argue that human dimensions research can do more than telling us about beliefs, values, and attitudes. It can also tell us about those ecological dynamics and improve our understanding thereof. And likewise, an understanding of how people respond to ecological change, this full interlinking of habitat and habitus, grows our understanding further and strengthens management. And so this represents a new way of thinking about human dimensions, what I call integrated human dimensions research, and it's at the core of my research program. But even still, something has been overlooked here. To understand outcomes for diverse stakeholders and to ensure they are equitable, I bring justice into this framework as well. By applying theories of justice to wildlife management, human dimensions research can better help resolve conflicts and support equitable and resilient policies. And finally, at the center of this framework is management, which informs and responds to these questions at every step of the way. So, looking at all of this together, this integrated human dimensions research framework connects the dots between some of the most important issues in wildlife science and management that are too rarely connected, and it invites a new diversity of thought into the human dimensions of wildlife. And in so doing, it also provides a powerful platform for promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion in and out of the academy, which I'll talk about today. So these rich connections make CEFS a great home for this research. And today I'll be showing how my research fits with what I see as a number of this department's strengths. My research will enrich the human dimensions of the department's already strong program in predator-prey ecology and add new dimensions to the great research happening here in conservation psychology. And while much of my work focuses on wildlife, this framework also has broad applications to work in landscape ecology and on diverse systems of production being studied here in CEFS. My work also fits well with the department's strength in applied interdisciplinary research, and my research on environmental justice can add something brand new to these collaborations. And finally, my work will help expand and strengthen the existing and strong agency partnerships between agencies in the university. So with that, I want to talk through 4 specific questions that put this framework into practice. And these questions are, how do perceptions of risk drive patterns of livestock predator conflict? How does tolerance for wildlife redefine habitat suitability? How can wildlife management better incorporate justice? And how does this framework respond to and inform management goals? So I'll start by talking about my research on risk perceptions. And what I'm showing here is a kind of menu bank of the theories and methods that I draw from in my research, and I'll keep returning to it for each project. In this case study, I drew from theories in conservation livelihoods and psychology, as well as wildlife and spatial ecology. And I used methods like interviews, participatory mapping, and spatial modeling to conduct this research. I was really fortunate to lead this research with the support of an amazing interdisciplinary team from Berkeley, with funding from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I also had the support of stellar undergraduate mentees. And as I'll stress throughout this talk, diversifying environmental sciences through the topics that I study, the collaborators I work with, and the students I mentor is a priority of mine. So in this study, I focused on livestock predation, and specifically the predation of sheep by coyotes in Northern California. Livestock predation is a huge driver of conflict in the system, but also around the world. And material costs to people can be high, and retaliations against predators can be devastating. And this is increasingly true in areas of ecological restoration where large carnivores are returning to landscapes for the first time in a long time. So in response to this conflict, researchers have been developing ecological models to help inform livestock predator conflict. And these models use approaches drawn from the ecology of risk in natural systems to model and predict the likelihood of predation risk of livestock. And these ecological approaches to predicting conflict are rapidly gaining popularity as predictive management tools. And so at my field site in Northern California, I poured through decades of rancher diaries and maps of kill locations to create one of these ecological models of predation. And I'm going to return to that in just a moment. But first, what really makes livestock predation a wicked problem for managers is the question of risk perception. And risk perception here is defined as a set of beliefs regarding the riskiness of the production landscape in terms of predation. And it's been hypothesized that it is the perception of risk that most powerfully drives conflict with predators. So at this study site, in addition to building an ecological model, I explored this question of risk perception through extensive interviews and participatory maps with livestock producers. And what we learned is that risk perceptions about carnivores loom large in ranchers' minds. They're connected to big concepts like identity, sense of place, and social context. We also learned that these ranchers knew the landscape really well. Their risk perceptions weren't just idle thoughts. They were driven by a deep ecological understanding and years of experience on the landscape. And as a result of this, risk perceptions have profound effects on husbandry practices. They determine where sheep are pastured, for how long, what kind of protections are used, and where humans spend their time on the landscape. So these risk perceptions form their own invisible landscape that shapes the physical environment from which ecologists can collect data and build those models like the ones I was just showing. So our research showed something very new. We showed that ignoring risk perceptions is ignoring an essential part of the landscape itself. And if ecological models don't take these risk perceptions into account, our research showed that they're subject to bias that can weaken their predictions. So to demonstrate this, we compared our ecological model with our participatory maps. And oftentimes these ecological models are considered as objective facts, and studies have even used them to try to correct risk perceptions. And that approach is understandable because we know from studies in conservation psychology that perceptions can vastly overinflate risk and err in other ways. So which one of these is right? Which one is more important? And what information do managers need? Well, our research said that the answer to these questions is to integrate these approaches, drawing from the strengths of both. We used risk perceptions to improve our ecological model in areas where we lacked data, and we used the ecological model to offer fine-scale insights within pastures. And in a way that was exciting, but also really intimidating, this model was immediately put to the test in the real world as the ranchers at our site incorporated it into their husbandry. But I'm excited to say that since we shared these findings, ranchers at the site have had 0 losses of sheep. And as a result, they've taken 0 coyotes, which is a huge reduction from previous years. As powerful as this integration has been, we're really just scratching the surface of how to link these two very different kinds of data. And so this kind of research offers an exciting opportunity for graduate students and postdocs to continue pushing this research forward. But I'll turn now to another surprisingly important outcome of this approach, which has to do with building trust with stakeholders. Because no matter how good our maps get, they won't be effective if agricultural producers don't want to use them. So what makes an effective livestock protection tool? To study this, I worked with an undergraduate mentee, Laura Volsky, who brought a unique set of skills as a writer and science communicator. And student mentees have been a core part of my work in research and in bringing diverse new thinkers into our field, and this project is a great example of both of those. So back to this question, what makes an effective livestock protection tool? There's been a push in the literature to provide ecological answers to this question. So fox lights, that's the yellow object pictured here, are one of these new high-tech gadgets in livestock protection. They automatically flash a flashing light at predators at night. And we set up an ecological test of this tool using remote camera traps at our study site. And what we found was that fox lights have a weak effect on coyote behavior. But that is not the end of this story, because we also interviewed ranchers about their willingness to use this tool both before and after seeing these results. And from these interviews, we again learned that a strictly ecological interpretation of effectiveness is limited. The ranchers we interviewed are impressive systems thinkers, And they pointed out that this ecological approach of isolating and testing tools individually is not realistic to their practice. Instead, they think of tools as part of a complex and dynamic toolkit that allows them to adaptively respond to landscapes that are changing in space and time. And just learning this was a really valuable insight into what effectiveness means ecologically. But we also learned about the human dimensions of what defines efficacy. Convenience, economics, empathy, these were all themes that came out of the interviews as being more important to whether ranchers would adopt tools, even if they had some proof of their ecological effectiveness. And one of the most important findings was that the messenger counts here too. There has to be trust in who recommends a tool. And in our study site and throughout much of the American West, trust between agricultural producers and scientists is very low. But this research also showed us that after working through multiple rounds of interviews and sharing this information, ranchers began coming back to us, seeking us out for more information and chances to share what they knew. And this shows that the research process itself can build trust if, and it's a big if, stakeholder perceptions are meaningfully included in the process. So to build on this, I've worked extensively in stakeholder engagement. And during this research, I received funding from the University of California Cooperative Extension to organize and facilitate a stakeholder workshop that included over 100 stakeholders, scientists, advocates, and agency staff. I was amazed by how much just sharing food and space could do to build trust between groups with long histories of tension. Seeing folks from coyote conservation organizations have lunch with wildlife services was a win in its own right of these workshops. But on top of that, stakeholder workshops are another way of promoting diversity in the environmental sciences. People on working lands often feel like outsiders in wildlife science and management, and many of them may have economic barriers to participation. So workshops like these are another great way to broaden the academic tent. And it turns out that this diversity of thought can really improve our science. In this case, it helped us identify new research questions that were shared by agencies, stakeholders, and scientists. And because of that, we built one of the first causal models of livestock predation and livestock protection tools, which we published last year, thanks to the discussions that came out of this workshop. In addition to research, we had management goals with this workshop. We demonstrated non-lethal livestock protection tools, and we set up a lending program for local ranchers to have access to them. And lastly, these workshops can strengthen ties between the university and agencies as well. I'm now working with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the University of California Cooperative Extension System, where we've funded a new interdisciplinary project that combines interviews about rancher risk perceptions with the simultaneous GPS collaring of sheep, coyotes, and guardian dogs to try to build a comprehensive socioecological model of conflict in the system. And looking forward, as part of the co-op, I'd be excited to link up this research on perceptions with the ecological research happening in programs like the Washington Predator-Prey Project. This part of my research program is growing fast, and I think it will provide an exciting diversity of interdisciplinary projects and collaborations for graduate students and postdocs. I want to pause here before moving on to the next research topic to talk about mentorship. I think the projects I've just described make it clear just how much diversity can improve the science that we do. I've talked about invisible landscapes, but my work is also about unheard voices. I see my role as making sure that these voices are heard, represented, and included in multiple venues. And I want to play a role in making sure that the future of our field doesn't look like the past. So to do that, I think mentorship has to go beyond just mentoring and also consider recruiting, professional development, and opportunities for structural change. So pictured here are some of the more than 30 mentees that I've worked with. I've helped students identify funding and successfully apply for over $10,000 through grants supporting research and diversity in the environmental sciences. And this has led to 8 mentee publications on top of many more senior theses. In my own recruiting efforts, I've been proactive in reaching out to Black, Latinx, and Indigenous student groups. And more than half the students that I've worked with have come from groups underrepresented in the environmental sciences. And working at the University of Washington with organizations like LSAMP and the Q Center can help me to continue and to include a wider diversity of scholarship in our field. And while academic mentoring is a passion of mine, it's not the only part of mentoring. While at Berkeley, I worked for 2 years as a mentor in a program for first generation, underserved, and undocumented students. And this experience taught me that going beyond just academic training and also doing mentoring in professional development and leadership can be transformative for retention, success, and even well-being. And to further support retention, I'm really inspired by mentors that I've had to try to cultivate a communal and familial atmosphere in my research group, to cultivate a sense of belonging and make sure that mentees have an unflinching peer support network during the roller coaster that is graduate school. Lastly, I'll mention that fighting for structural change within organizations is essential to changing systems of exclusion. And along these lines, I've worked with Berkeley's graduate admissions committees to argue for the removal of the GRE. And I've served on Berkeley's graduate funding committee to help create a flexible funding program that lowered financial barriers to applicants in one of the nation's most expensive cities. So I can only express my excitement at the commitment to diversity and mentorship that I see in CEFs, and I think that it's an ideal landing place for my approach to mentorship. I'll turn back now to my research, and next I'm going to discuss a study that engages a diverse body of scholarship, stakeholders, and geographies. And here I'll be centering ecological dynamics to answer the question, how does tolerance for wildlife redefine habitat suitability? And I draw on this research primarily from environmental history and the humanities, as well as wildlife and spatial ecology. And I use a diverse set of approaches, including ethnography, surveys, historical ecology, and spatial modeling to do this work. Once again, I've been fortunate to work with an inspiring group of interdisciplinary co-authors at UCSB on this NSF-funded research. And I'll start by talking about habitat, where ecologists have gotten amazingly sophisticated at producing fine-scale habitat suitability models like these that are shown. And these ecological models have improved the success of restoration programs by predicting where species can survive and thrive. But just as I discussed in talking about risk perceptions, we can improve management even more through an integration with human dimensions research. So wildlife tolerance is defined as the ability and willingness of an individual to absorb the costs of living with wildlife. And it's another one of these invisible landscapes that have rarely been included in habitat suitability models, but that can profoundly alter what kind of habitat is suitable. And this is especially true for wide-ranging and adaptable species like large carnivores, where patterns of tolerance may determine where species can survive and thrive even more than biophysical factors. I'm excited to talk now about grizzly bears, which are one of these wide-ranging, adaptable large carnivores and are the focus of my postdoctoral research. I know that Washington is no stranger to grizzly bear reintroduction proposals, nor to the role of tolerance in determining the outcome of policy. But right now in California, there are also talks brewing about reintroducing grizzly bears. And my research looks at tolerance in both space and time to help inform this policy before it becomes settled. So I'll first talk about tolerance in space. Mapping tolerance is challenging in the first place, and it's even more challenging for restoration projects where the target species is absent. And in the case of grizzly bears, they've been extinct in California for almost 100 years. So to address this challenge, my research uses an approach from the social sciences called triangulation. And this brings together multiple kinds of data sets that can help predict patterns of tolerance. To give an example, historical data can reveal where bears once occurred in the state and the patterns of intolerance that drove them extinct here in the recent past. And so in this research, I use both prehistorical records as well as an exhaustive catalog of grizzly bear sightings and encounters from early Europeans in California. I also look at what are called taxonomic analogs, including data on the habitat suitability and tolerance of animals like black bears and pumas in California today. And lastly, though grizzlies don't occur in California anymore, similar species of brown bears do occur in the Rocky Mountains and in Europe. And these similar cultural and ecological contexts can teach us about patterns of tolerance as well. So all of this triangulation is great, but why not just do something more direct, like ask people what they think? So in fact, in this research, I have included a survey of over 1,000 Californians on their tolerance for grizzly bears. But amazingly, maybe embarrassingly for us, this survey showed that only a fraction of people in California even know that grizzly bears are absent in the state. So we're working in a low knowledge environment, and that makes the need to innovate through methods like triangulation all the more essential. So this is a figure from this research, and what this figure suggests is that human tolerance is likely to fundamentally redefine where suitable habitat for grizzly bears will occur. And this means that we need to broaden conversations about habitat writ large in order to better understand their human dimensions. If we don't take patterns of tolerance into account in policy and management, controversial species like grizzly bears can court even greater controversy. Looking forward, this method is especially exciting to me because it's applicable to a variety of landscapes, geographies, and species. And work in this theme has great potential to support graduate and postdoc research. I think it can also form the basis of partnerships with innovative initiatives at the University of Washington, like the Earth Lab. And I think it can offer a great tool to agency partners like WDFW and WDNR to apply to species of local concern like wolves. And pictured here is OR 93. This is the wolf that's made the epic journey south to California. And it serves as a great reminder of how important it is to understand both the ecological and the human dimensions that define habitat for species like this. Now, I've talked about space, but it's also important to understand time when it comes to tolerance. A lot of research in the human dimensions of wildlife offers us snapshots in time, but we're in urgent need of work that tracks change over time in this domain. So before the pandemic, if anyone remembers what life was like then, I received grant funding to conduct research here in the California mountains with a growing network of agency personnel and local stakeholders to initiate a long-term longitudinal study of tolerance for grizzly bears. And in this research, we're combining a grounded ethnographic approach with surveys that are iterated annually to track changes in attitudes. And agency collaborators are especially excited about this project because it's one of the first of its kind to track how attitudes change, starting from before any kind of policy implementation has happened and continuing forward as policy becomes more specific and more concrete. Now, in spite of COVID restrictions, this project has still managed to get off the ground, and that has much to do with the devoted efforts of Kayla Gorman, a former undergraduate mentee. And Kayla received summer funding last year through a diversity grant in environmental research, and I'm excited to say that she'll continue to be a colleague going forward. Kayla will be continuing to work on this project during her graduate studies, and I expect this long-term project to support additional graduate student leadership in the future. So coming back to this framework, I've talked a lot so far about how I think my research enriches the science and management of wildlife, but wildlife management can also have tremendous consequences for people. So I want to turn now to justice, which is a glaring missing piece of traditional human dimensions research in wildlife management. Critics of wildlife conservation and management have pointed out colonial history, and in some cases, ongoing practices of inequity. And so addressing this tension head on is essential to ensuring that the future of wildlife management is just and sustainable for a diversity of stakeholders. And as I'll talk about, this approach can also ensure that policy maintains the kind of popular support that helps it endure in the long term. So how can wildlife management better incorporate justice? Because this topic has rarely been broached in wildlife management, my research focuses on developing new theories that can guide future scholarship and practice. I conduct this research with a team from UCSB and UC Davis with funding from the Belmont Forum and NSF. And this team includes professors that are established in the field, as well as graduate scholars that are pushing this conversation to exciting new places. And luckily, in this research, we don't have to start from scratch. We build on established research and theory in environmental justice, often called EJ, which seeks to document and redress the disproportionate environmental burdens and benefits associated with social inequalities. When it comes to wildlife, vulnerable, marginalized, and disempowered people are often among those living in closest proximity to wildlife, especially in areas where restoration is occurring. So this body of theory in environmental justice perfectly applies here, even though it's almost never been applied to wildlife issues. So I take up these questions in a paper that develops an environmental justice framework for large carnivore reintroductions and recoveries. And in this research, we systematically describe these programs in the language of justice to answer questions like, who is harmed by management and policy? Who can participate in its development and implementation? And whose worldviews are recognized in the process? And human dimensions research has in fact made great contributions to questions of distribution and participation, but our research shows just how important and overlooked recognition justice is. We showed that recognition, and often the lack thereof, lies at the root of many conflicts about wildlife management. So foregrounding recognition in policy and in public engagement offers new opportunities for ensuring just and enduring outcomes of management and policy. But in addition to recognition justice, we use this framework to identify other ways of putting justice into practice, and I want to give one example of that. At its core, environmental justice research is action-oriented and community-engaged. And so while it's a great way to diversify scholarship, it also helps ensure that academic ideas about diversity and inclusion extend into the public sphere. And so with this in mind, I organized and raised funding for a conference panel that brought together community conservation leaders from around the world. And these leaders shared their visions and experience in how inclusive wildlife management can function, and how ideas of distribution, participation, and recognition are manifested in their work on the ground. And all of these leaders made it clear that by rigorously incorporating justice into management, positive outcomes for people and wildlife are possible. They also offered the important insight that management that is just is also more long-lasting and resilient to economic and political change because it can garner popular support. So there are great opportunities for incorporating justice into wildlife management, but our research also identified major roadblocks. And the first of these will be familiar because it's risk perceptions. And our research showed that risk perceptions are so important to environmental justice that they can warp the outcomes of these other approaches. And so with that in mind, we developed a new theory called affective justice, which asks whose risk perceptions matter. And among other things in this theory, we showed how histories of equating fear of predators with fear of Black and brown people and immigrants in America and Europe has functionally linked programs of wildlife eradication and human marginalization. And these overlooked links are not merely historical, they continue to perpetuate colonial practices in conservation and management today. So by developing the theory of affective justice, our research has exposed an important site for future work on this topic, and this has rich potential for graduate student leadership. A second roadblock that I want to talk about involves the history of conservation, especially as it relates to Indigenous people. I'm working right now with Indigenous people and Indigenous scholars on a manuscript applying concepts that have emerged from Indigenous environmental justice, which is its own body of research. And these concepts include kincentricity and radical relationality, and we're applying them to the management of cultural keystone species in California, like elk, condor, and beaver. And we're also working on research that uses theories to help improve intergovernmental coordination between the Karuk tribe and the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. And so with this position with the co-op, I would be particularly interested in working with Indigenous people in Washington to extend these ideas to species like salmon, as well as to apply the lessons from this research to strengthen intergovernmental relations between tribal governments and wildlife agencies. And this body of research is another one where graduate student leadership can provide the crucial new ideas and approaches needed to understand these complex challenges. So I've talked now about the research elements that distinguish this integrated human dimensions framework from more traditional approaches, but management sits at the center of this framework. And so I want to talk about how I conduct research that responds to and informs management goals. And in my research, this begins with a proactive approach to collaboration. I've worked to build a network of partnerships that's still growing, and these partnerships have allowed agencies to contribute to my work at every stage. So from question formation to funding to broadcasting work to stakeholders, I've worked closely with multiple agencies every step of the way. And so now I'm going to talk about two more projects that demonstrate my approach to agency partnership. And I'm going to resist the temptation to go into detail on their methods and findings, as tempting as that is, just to focus on this aspect of the research. So first, I'll talk about hunters. In this project, I worked closely with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and UC Berkeley to fund a large interdisciplinary project in support of California's revisions of its deer management plan. Together, we identified the need for research on a unique human dimension of wildlife management, which is the movement and behavior of hunters themselves. So in collaboration with a team of ecologists, I led a project that distributed handheld GPS loggers to over 400 hunters to track their movements. And we applied the tools of movement ecology to this one-of-a-kind data set, which is being prepared for publication. But crucially, this research also helped meet the goals of our agency partner, and our analyses and raw data have both been directly incorporated into the state's deer management plans. And second, I want to talk about fences. In reaching out to county land managers in my study area, I learned that one of their most pressing management interests regarding the human dimensions of wildlife was to learn more about fences. And so I initiated research that turned into a review on socio-ecological effects of fences. And this review produced the first regional scale map of fence densities and distributions, and it also made policy recommendations based on our findings. This research received press in the popular media, and I think this kind of public engagement through science communication can be an important tool for agency partnership, helping connect agencies to the public. And in this case, it also broadened the reach of this work and broadcast it to other agencies. So now I'm advising not just the original county land managers who inspired this idea, but also the BLM and the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife on their fence policies. Our research team is continuing to conduct research on the social, economic, and political effects of fences. And the close agency ties that I've developed in this process have made a big difference in this very applied research. Thanks to those close ties, we can better understand the most important questions to ask and make sure that our research directly responds to management needs. So I'll return now to this guiding framework on my vision of integrated human dimensions research. I've gone through these 4 core principles that I laid out at the beginning, and I've showed how I connect the dots between some of the most important but often disconnected issues in wildlife science and management. So I want to conclude now by talking about how these principles inform the research program that I would bring to this position. So to begin, more work is needed just to understand the human dimension side of wildlife management. And my research in risk perceptions points to important future directions on this subject that's so central to human-wildlife conflict. Improving our quantitative understanding of how risk perceptions can be linked with ecological models can add a lot to management, but so too can understanding risk perception in context, whether it's about belonging, place, and identity. This can help us understand the extent to which conflict is about wildlife versus being about social life. And lastly, much of the work on risk perceptions occurs in rural areas, but extending these questions across gradients of human density can not only teach us about perceptions in new contexts, it can offer important opportunities to engage with communities and diversify the people and places involved in this research. I've talked a lot today about linking human dimensions and ecological dynamics, and this research emphasis provides exciting opportunities for interdisciplinary collaboration. The tolerance mapping that I've done on grizzly bears is some of the first of its kind, and these methods can be extended to other species and other geographies. But in addition, by rendering this invisible tolerance landscape visible, there are great opportunities for partnering with research on climate change and connectivity happening in CEFs, and to think about what this means for the future. And thinking further about the future, my program will continue to conduct groundbreaking longitudinal surveys of attitudes as they relate to wildlife. But it's also important to think about the future of more than one species at a time. So my research will extend the methods I've developed to understand how the recovery of one wildlife species may affect attitudes about the next recovery that follows in sequence. And finally, if COVID has taught me anything, it's to keep innovating. And so my work will explore new methods that use digital and social media as tools for understanding patterns of tolerance in space and time. Turning now to questions of justice, while I've begun developing theoretical insights into these questions, it's clear that testing them empirically will deepen our understanding of their context and generality. So my research program will continue to work with Indigenous people on cultural keystone species and to test the theories that we've developed about large carnivores. And lastly, this research in justice highlighted new opportunities for using approaches like recognition justice and affective justice during stakeholder engagement to better understand the roots of conflict and help resolve them. So finally, I've centered management throughout my work, and this position offers an incredible opportunity to further strengthen those collaborations and partnerships. So I'm eager to closely collaborate with agency partners about the management challenges here in Washington and to develop socio-ecological research to help meet applied management goals. I can't think of a better place to grow this research program than here in CEFs. And so to reiterate this fit, I think my research will mesh with the department's strengths, and it's broad enough to engage with the rich scholarship on a diversity of topics happening here in CEFs. My research will also bring new strengths and new topics to the department and be a source of interdisciplinary thinking and collaboration. And in this position, I would be really eager to collaborate with the incredible research groups here in the department, as well as to link agency partners to the transformative research happening on campus. So with that, I'll conclude my talk. Once again, I'm so delighted to have been able to share this with all of you. I'm honored to have been included, and now I'm happy to take your questions. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. We're all virtually applauding.
It's thunderous. Thank you.
So everyone, please feel free to continue to put your questions in the Q&A. There's a little icon down at the bottom of your Zoom screen called Q&A. You click on that and you'll be able to enter a question. We've already got a few to get us started here. So a question from John Marsliff. One of the references you made early, relatively early in your talk about the change in outcomes that you saw with the work on coyotes and predation and husbandry. John's question is, what did ranchers change in their husbandry that actually reduced the predation and the culling of coyotes?
That's a great question. Yeah, I'm really happy that someone asked that. And so the answer to that question is part of the reason that we were interested in these non-lethal livestock protection tools. So the way that we did it was we kind of identified places that we thought would be hotspots of conflict based on the modeling and risk perception mapping that we did. And we used those to target the deployment of non-lethal tools like guardian dogs, flashing light, temporary electric fencing. And so those are some of the measures that have been put in place to help do that.
Great, thank you. Lisanne Petraka asks, I see that your integrated risk model integrated ecological risk with perceived risk. However, there is literature to support that actual versus perceived risk are often very different. Can you talk about how your work would be able to differentiate between these different risk types, that is actual versus perceived risk?
I think it's a great question, and it's one of the parts of the literature that we were kind of directly engaging with in that paper. And so as the questioner rightly points out, there is literature to say that in some cases, risk perceptions can really differ from observed patterns of risk. But what we showed is that oftentimes the the landscape from which those ecological models are produced has already been biased by decisions that have been made based on risk perceptions. So if those risk perceptions aren't incorporated, there's selection bias that's going into these models. Now, if they're really robustly included, that can be avoided, and there's some good research that's done that. But in general, that's really a missing piece of this literature. And so our paper was actually kind of pushing back a little bit against that approach and saying that we can't simply rely on the collection of kill sites and ecological data to understand this issue. We also have to understand what's driving people's decision-making, which has a lot to do with risk perception. So I think it's a really important question to keep pursuing. And one of the things that we're looking at for future research is how to improve that kind of integration. We did it in a sort of initial approach in our research, but there's a lot of room for thinking about how to re-quantify risk models. So whether to use equal intervals to say what's high, medium, and low risk, or to use geometric intervals, things like that that can help bring those ecological models into better dialogue with what we know about conservation psychology.
Right, that's really interesting, that concept of feedbacks in the system where perceived risk actually even influences our measurement of actual risk. That's
exactly, yeah.
Cool. Okay, John Marsleth, while I agree that tolerance does affect habitat suitability, I worry that using it to define suitable conservation areas could reduce what a species actually needs to thrive. Should we write off important areas that have low tolerance, or should we use this knowledge to reduce intolerance in biologically important areas?
Yeah, terrific question. And so I think it gets back to one of the kind of core ideas about triangulation as a method that I didn't really get into in this. And in the social sciences, the idea behind triangulation is that you may not just arrive at convergence. So this triangulating process, the goal of it is not just to say, this is where a grizzly bear should go based on bringing together tolerance and habitat suitability. It can also raise important questions about how we think about habitat and how we make decisions. And so the goal of that research isn't to suggest that we have to completely restrict habitat suitability based on tolerance. It's just to say that there are ways, important ways of thinking about and spatially bringing in this important question of tolerance that haven't been done. So bringing this into the conversation and making it a broader conversation than just a kind of ecological modeling exercise. So yeah, that's kind of our approach with that. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Great, thanks. Okay, I have a question from Tim Quinn. Tim, I hope I get this question right. I'm gonna ask it, and then I might turn on your microphone just to make sure that I've gotten it correct. So Tim's question is, how much of existing and new theory relates to non-predator-prey relationships, such as keeping common species common and working to protect habitat across imperiled ecosystems and habitat types? Tim, did I get that question right, or please expand if I didn't?
Yeah, I think you did. What I'm trying to get at is the idea that intolerance towards land use other than particular types of land use that best serve humans, i.e. land uses that serve other species, is a type of intolerance that we deal with. And I was wondering how we would address that type of intolerance and whether or not there's an ability to apply some of the tools that you use to try to find more common ground or different ways of talking about it in ways that reduce some of that intolerance.
Yeah, so if I understand the question, I think, happily, that there are a lot of models of habitat suitability that do include land use and human activity. Road networks and livestock production landscapes have been brought into a lot of habitat suitability models, especially for reintroductions. So I think the piece that I'm trying to add is that that still masks spatial variation in the way that people who are living on the landscape are going to respond to and behave around animals. So even if we understand, that tolerance is likely to be generally lower on an agricultural production landscape than it might be in federal protected land, we still don't know about that variation within people that are occupying both of those. There's diversity within each of those kinds of landscape types that's still being missed by just looking at some of these broader ways of categorizing land ownership, land use, and human activity. So that's kind of what we're trying to push with this research. I hope I answered the question rightly. I'm happy to take another stab if I misinterpreted what was being asked.
Is that good, Tim?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. That answered my question.
Terrific, thanks.
Thanks. Okay, great. So the next question is from Beth Gardner. Great talk and lots of great ideas. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the statistical tools you use in your work, specific models, programming languages, and so on.
Sure, yeah. As you can probably tell, I am someone who has a background in using spatial analysis in ArcGIS and in R. And so those tools are kind of typically part of most of the research that I do. So some of the work on risk mapping actually draws from Ecology. The ecological predation models that I showed are actually based on things like resource selection functions using logistic regression to produce those. In the tolerance mapping stuff, that's the kind of statistics and mapping of that are really not the hard part. The challenging part of that is figuring out what data is relevant and what data is kind of useful and meaningful to bring into this triangulation and then collecting it. So, digging through historical archives to find these sightings and encounters and figuring out how to set up surveys. They are really complicated processes, but they produce fairly simple spatial analysis. I've mentioned that I have worked with movement ecologists on some of the hunter data, and in the fence research, I did some spatial modeling that was, combined some light remote sensing, which I'm definitely not an expert with some, just linear modeling. So I'm by no means a statistics whiz, but I do have a geospatial toolkit that I like to use in all of my projects.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Ken Warhite asks, you mentioned that there is distrust between ranchers and scientists. Why does that distrust exist?
Wow. Yeah, great,
easy one.
Great question. There was published this year a really interesting report, and it came out of Duke's Nicholas School of the Environment, and it was a kind of sweeping characterization of rural attitudes toward the environment in America. And it had some surprising findings, one of which was that values between rural and urban Americans about the environment are not as different as we often like to think. There's a lot of shared values there. And so the things that cause that distrust are often about other things, whether it's politics or identity or senses of history or things like justice. That's one of the things that attracted me to the field of environmental justice, is that I saw a lot of this distrust coming from a sense of not being recognized, not having fears and vulnerabilities being acknowledged. And so that's one of the things that I wanted to explore in that project. So those are some of the roots of it. And then I think it's also important to just reiterate how important politicization is in America right now. With the Grizzly Project, one of the amazing things that we saw in the paper about the survey of tolerance, in addition to Californians not knowing that there aren't grizzly bears in the state, was that there was surprisingly broad support for this reintroduction. And that really differs from places like Washington, where it's a very polarizing issue. And our hypothesis is that because it's not a concrete policy yet, it hasn't become politicized. And that politicization is something to really get ahead of in thinking about this stuff. Because yeah, even when values are shared, that can really undermine trust. So that's my extremely short answer to a very good but very long question. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Okay, so Brianna Abrams asks, you mentioned using longitudinal data to look at changes in tolerance over time. Is there any ongoing work or future efforts to combine this longitudinal data and spatial mapping to make dynamic risk habitat maps that change over time?
I honestly think that's a fantastic idea, and it's something that I think will be part of my research going forward. So bringing these kinds of changes in space and changes in time together, I think is the kind of cutting edge and future of human dimensions research along these lines. So I'm definitely interested in doing that. I think ways that I can see that being really productive are bringing some of these mapping techniques of social dimensions like tolerance and risk into dialogue with some of the climate projections that that are being produced to help us think about, how this isn't just a snapshot in time, but how it might, how things might change in the future as conditions change. So I think it's really important work. I think no one has done it. I think it's an important thing to do in the future, and it's something that I hope to be a part of kind of bringing to life. So yeah, it's a great question.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, I'm really interested in that. As a population ecologist, we always find it more interesting to think about, or at least I do, to think about the dynamics rather than the state of the system. And it does seem like there's this really interesting thing happening where we have focused so much on the sort of urbanization, but now we're seeing sort of in some places a little bit the opposite happening, right? We're now seeing people on the outskirts of cities who have different kinds of attitudes, who are coming up against damage issues and conflict with large predators. It's certainly, if you look in sort of east of Seattle, this is a big issue. We now, with the pandemic, now realize we also have urban dwellers moving back into more rural settings, and that may be a trend that continues after the pandemic. So it seems like it offers a really interesting opportunity to understand those dynamics. Have you heard any discussion about those kinds of
It brings to mind two things for me, and one is a conversation that's been happening in fields like geography and political ecology for the last 10 or 15, maybe even 20 years or so, about what's called the New West. And it's about characterizing some of these changes that you're describing. So, ex-urban development, the changing kind of environmental value systems of people as populations shift around in the Western United States, and the reactions against that, as someone was asking about that trust question. So some of that is a reaction against what's seen as changing landscapes, so that means that these conflicts at times aren't actually about the thing itself. They might not be about wildlife. They're about perceptions of change that affect identity and history and your place in the world. So there's a big body of scholarship about that, about the New West in geography and political ecology. And then the other thing that this makes me think of is some really interesting research that's coming out of Montana right now, where grizzly bears are also making recoveries. And what's happening there is a little bit of a space for time substitution. So some researchers there are looking at places where grizzly bears have kind of been recovered for different amounts of time. And what they're finding is that familiarity is actually improving tolerance. So the longer people have lived with grizzly bears, the more they're willing to tolerate them, versus people who are kind of experiencing them in their backyards for the first time. There's a lot of intolerance associated with that. So that's a really interesting project that I'm following really closely, but something that I think dovetails with what you're asking about.
Great, thank you. We have one other question here. I know it's 1 o'clock, so I'm just going to do this question and then we'll close down. But this is such a great one. I think this is Bernard Borman, I'm assuming. So the question is, do you see tribes pushing treaty rights over upland wildlife management on ceded lands parallel to the Bolt decision? If you're familiar with the Bolt decision, this was a major decision in the late 70s that set forth the rights of Native Americans to fisheries. So the question is about, is there going to be a parallel to that where tribes have or pursue rights to upland wildlife.
And when you say upland wildlife, can you tell me what you mean by that?
I'm thinking that means basically so terrestrial wildlife rather than sort of fisheries or, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. I think that the person asking it is right, that there's been a lot more work that I'm familiar with about some of these issues of aquatic wildlife and tribal sovereignty than there has been about terrestrial wildlife. In putting this research together, we've actually been really surprised about how little writing there has been. And so I don't know that I can answer the question about the future of policy, but I can talk about some things that I'm seeing and learning from speaking with people about this issue. One is traditional management practices in a way that promotes food sovereignty. That's a really important topic that people have been pushing for in the tribal communities that we work with. And another issue is having a voice, so this kind of participatory question in how wildlife management decisions are made by state and federal managers. And I'm most familiar with California. I can't speak for Washington, but there's been just an incredible kind of groundswell of work in research and in advocacy happening among the tribal groups that I work with, including the Karuk and Hupa, to try to be part of this process, to have their voices heard and to say, we will use the language that you use if it gives us a better seat at the table. So those are kind of two trends that I've seen and thinking about this. I think it's really hard to predict what the future of policy might be, but I do see some kind of encouraging signs that there have been opportunities to improve engagement and to kind of repair some of the historically tense relations. And so that's part of some of the work that we're trying to do, is figuring out how bringing some of these theories of justice can continue to make those improvements.
Great, thank you so much. I think we better leave it there.
Right.
Thanks everyone for joining us. And again, we're all virtually applauding. Thank you so much, Alex, for taking time to talk to us today. Really appreciate it. Lots of very interesting stuff. And we look forward to talking to you more over the next couple of weeks.
Well, I'm looking forward to it too. And thank you to everyone for spending this time with me. I really appreciate it.
Take care. Signing off. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.